Okay. So, this is a research that came up with, this idea that we were talking, it came up from an independent study that Tonya did with me, where she herself was a military spouse. And, she realized that a lot of time, what happens is people who come back from deployment or during the deployment when they're away, the military spouses go through mental, anxiety and depression and this a behavioral health condition that are unique, and that is not that need. There is a need to separately tag it and label it. It is important that we separately label it. So when we looked at the literature, we found that there is PTSD, there is secondary trauma, there is all these different mental health conditions that are out there, but they really do not fit in when it comes to military spouses, especially PTSD kind of situation. PTSD is a situation that is like, there is a requirement sometimes that you need to, see the traumatic event in person, which they don't. Secondary trauma to a great extent happens when, especially a human service professional, like a psychologist or a social worker who are dealing with clients, and there is transference and counter-transference in which a trauma gets passed over to you. But in this circumstances, a military spouse is basically, is not a human service worker. They get this, transference of trauma involuntarily during the whole day. And so we thought that why not try to understand what kind of mental health issues they have, how it is different, what are the different demographic predictors or variables that we can think about, contributing to this. So we decided to collect data, and the only way you can collect data for this is snowballing. So we did snowball. We found one person, and through that person's network, the other person, and we created a questionnaire. We consulted many other questionnaires and kind of given birth to a new kind of questionnaire that we will factor analyze eventually. But right now, the presentation that we are doing is basically giving a brief descriptive idea of the contours of the problem. So I will invite Tonya to give a background and talk about it.
Okay.
I know that she has done that, by the way, this presentation in one of the conferences in Florida at the what is the name of the university?
St. Leo University in Florida.
They have a veteran conference, especially on veteran social work. Tonya is also one of the first person to take our online military social work class. We are trying to do some kind of, there is a tremendous interest among students, not only social work students, but also rehab and psychology students, to look at military veteran services as a specialization. And many jobs are getting created around this area, and so that is also something that we can look for. So Tonya, if you can talk about, and then I'll chip in whenever.
Okay. So like Dr. Drew said, this kind of came about because I have some personal experience with it, and a lot of these things have affected me personally. So when I came into the academic aspect of it, I wanted to look at it because I realized that there's something going on that hasn't been looked at. So that's kind of what started this. Let's see if I can figure this out. So this is kind of my background rationale. I took a family systems perspective from social work, and basically that implies that each family, you have your roles in your family, and they're very defined, and you have patterns of behavior, and those all work together to provide your balance in your family. So when you're in the military and you're going through deployments and separations, a lot of times that balance is interrupted. So it affects the entire family system and not just the military member, which is main focus in the media, and with mental health services, it's mainly focused on the service member, but this is impacting the family members as well. So let's see here. So I looked at a lot of the just military stressors in life in general, and obviously deployment is a huge stressor in military families, but there's also when you first join the military and you're separated from your family, you're expected to pick up and to move. You leave your family, your friends, everything behind, and you basically start completely over in a place where you don't know anyone. And that's enough to cause some anxiety in almost anybody. So, and then you're dealing with frequent moves. Typically every 3 years or so, you're moved to a different base, so you're starting completely over again. You know, you've met these people and now you have to leave again. So that's a lot of stress on anyone, and moving around the country, it's very difficult. I don't know if you guys have done that, but it's very difficult, and just moving itself is a difficult process, and the military definitely compounds that because you have to follow all their restrictions. So, and there's also a lot of frequent separation that people may not realize, like the training and having to be gone. So, and when I was living this life, the separation, it was a lot more than deployment. I went through several deployments as well, but also when they're home, they could be gone for 2-3 weeks, months, you know, and that's not even considered a deployment. And a lot of times that's overlooked by civilians because they don't realize that they are gone as much as they are, because they do have to train before they go on the deployments. So, and then the stress that's put on the spouse during deployment, a lot of times it outweighs the available resources. And a lot of the spouses are younger and may not necessarily have the coping skills they need to be able to deal with the stress of military life. And there are places on base that you can go and talk to people, but a lot of times the spouses, they're new to the military culture and they don't realize this, and they don't know where to go or who to reach out to for help. So definitely the stress is outweighing the helping factors. And then I looked and did my lit review about some of the findings. And this study right here with Eaton, it's one of the biggest studies in military spouses, and it's one of the only ones, unfortunately, but they had 940 spouses, and of that, 20% met the criteria for major depression or generalized anxiety disorder. And that's comparable to the rates of the service members when they come back from combat. So it's definitely real, and they are finding it. And you know, and like I said, this is one of the first and only studies that have looked at the spouses, but they did have really significant results when they looked at it. And then Mansfield, they found that extended deployments, so the longer the deployment, not necessarily the number of deployments, it led to increased diagnoses of anxiety disorder, depressive disorders, and also sleep disorders in spouses post-deployment. So the longer the guys are deployed, and we know that with recent combat, they have extended the length of deployments. They went from 6 months to 12 to 15 months. So the service members that were deployed for that length of time, their spouses were suffering. So, let's see. And then this is very interesting to me. We found that the mental health of the military spouse, it directly impacts the health and morale of the service member. So service members that have spouses that are suffering from anxiety and depression are more likely to leave the military. So by addressing the mental health needs of military spouses, the military would actually increase their retention rates, because if the spouse is healthier, then it's been shown that the service member is more likely to stay and re-enlist. So, okay, so now I can talk about kind of what we did. So we looked at it, and I kind of took the perspective of, I wanted to see the effects of multiple and or lengthy deployments on the mental health of military spouses, because I kind of looked at it like the more deployments they had gone through, the worse the mental health of the spouse would be. I also wanted to look at the impact of perceived social support available to the military spouse, and I did it on perception because that's what really matters. If someone perceives they have social support, then they would be more likely to be okay, is kind of what we looked at. And then I looked at the relationship between the partner's military service and the trauma symptoms in the military spouse, and the types of interventions used to treat the mental health disorders in military spouses. So that's just some of the stuff that we looked at. Okay.
This is really important.
I know. Thank you. I appreciate hearing that. But this is my passion, so I feel like it's definitely really important. But it's really good to hear that from someone else. So then I looked at my measures. I developed a questionnaire. And we called it military spousal secondary trauma. So basically we took components of several different validated questionnaires and surveys, like Beck's depression scale, the anxiety scale, and a secondary trauma scale, as well as a PTSD checklist. So I took those and I tweaked them so that they would kind of look more at specific factors related to military life. So the questions were directly related to military life. So that way we could look and say, okay, this isn't outside stress, this is directly impacting the military culture. So, and on my scale, I did a Likert style scale, and 1 was never and 5 was always. And the variables were interval, and the score ranged from 72 to 360, and the score of 216 or higher was indicative of our military spousal secondary trauma, and the higher the score indicated the greater the severity. So, and then some of the sample questions were like, when I miss a chance to communicate with my spouse by phone call, Skype, etc., I feel guilty. Or I get aggravated when civilians claim to understand what I'm going through. So you can kind of tell by those samples, like I geared it very much towards the military lifestyle. So, and like Dr. Drew said, we did a snowball sample. I had access to an FRG group, so I started out with them. Our N eventually ended up being 217. They were all
female, huh?
All female. I couldn't find males. I tried.
And the distribution of male is very disproportionate
Right.
in the real world of military spouse.
And you know, I would love to look at males because actually they're probably impacted at a greater.
I'm definitely connecting you with my son and daughter-in-law because they'll be very interested in your work.
Because I actually think the males would be impacted more because they have a totally different experience. And when I was in the conference in Florida, I got to speak to a male spouse, and he was very interested in this. And I got to talk to him about his experience and how different it is, because the FRG, which is the Family Readiness Group, which is a support group for spouses, and it is for spouses, but it's typically all female. And he talked about the seclusion that he felt, because he wasn't necessarily allowed to be friends with the female spouses while their spouses were deployed, because then they have to worry about this man coming in and taking their women while they're gone, even though his spouse was there with them. So their experience is very much different, and I think that it probably would impact them even more. So I would be very interested in looking at males. But I did get all females, so I got 217, and the criteria was that they had been through at least one deployment with their spouse. And like I said, it was snowball, and let's see. And I did get all branches, and I also got active duty, National Guard, and reserve. So it's spread across the spectrum. I got a little bit of everybody, so I was really glad that that happened that way. So in order to do the data collection, we gathered it via an anonymous online questionnaire, which was very efficient. And it took about 10 minutes for them to complete. So there's a lot of questions, but they were pretty straightforward and simple, so it didn't take a long time to do it. So the demographics that we got, 95% of my participants, they had a husband who was active duty. So most of these are active duty spouses, which is important because in the literature, the majority of spousal literature is based on National Guard members. So this is kind of new on that aspect as well, because it's typically they're looking at National Guard. So I was excited about that as well. It was 64% Army, 7% Air Force, 21% Navy, and 8% Marine Corps. 71% had a spouse who was enlisted. I don't know if you guys know the difference between enlisted and officer class. It's basically just two different classes in the military. So the enlisted is typically young guys straight out of high school, while the officers are usually college educated. So there's that difference in kind of class. So 71% were enlisted, 24% were officer class, and then I also had 2% that were warrant officers. And a warrant officer is someone who starts off as enlisted and then kind of branches over to an officer, and they become a warrant officer. And I was very excited that I was able to find some of them, because it's kind of a rare thing in the military, so I was really excited that I got a sampling from them as well. The mean age of the participants was 32. The mean length of marriage was 9 years, and the mean number of deployments was 3.5, with a total length of deployment averaging about 27 months, and that's for all the deployments. So that would be like, they could have one deployment was 12 months, another was 12 months, and then they were gone for 3. So that was a life total of deployment length. Okay, so now I assessed for whether or not their spouse, so the service member, had been diagnosed with PTSD, because my thought process was the service members that had been diagnosed with PTSD, their spouses would have more issues than not. So 21%, which was 46, they indicated that their spouse had been diagnosed with PTSD. Now, we all know that diagnosed and having it are two different things, so there's a possibility that many more of them actually are suffering from PTSD, but I just looked at the diagnosed cases of PTSD. So we had 46 people that said yes. 25%, which was 54, reported that their spouse had been injured while serving overseas. Now, my rationale for looking at injury, I wanted to look at physical versus mental injury, so that's why I assessed for looking to see if they had been wounded overseas. And then, since I was looking at social support and the protective factors of having adequate social support, I looked at that. So 35% indicated they did not feel they had adequate social support. So that was 75 of my participants felt that they did not have adequate social support. So now we can talk about, do you guys have any questions? I feel like I'm talking really fast and throwing out a lot. Okay. So some of my results, so like I said earlier, a score of 216 or higher is indicative of the condition proposed as military spousal secondary trauma. And in our sample, 64 people, which is 30%, scored at or above the cutoff of 216. So in our sample, 30% would be classified as having this, which is a pretty big number.
How did you come to that score of 216?
So the Likert scale was on a score of a 1 to 5. So the number of questions I had, I think it was 72. So the highest score was 360.
So we kind of added the scales of the scores, different things,
and then
summative number.
Yeah, and then a couple of the questions assessed for protective factors, so we had to reverse code those, because I did have some protective factor questions as well, so we reversed those. So yeah, so the highest score is 360, but 216 would be indicated that they said sometimes or frequently to almost everything. So that's how we got to that. And then, so like I kind of figured, perceived social support was found to be a protective factor. So those who perceived themselves as having adequate social support scored significantly lower than those who did not. And my P was 0. So obviously very significant. So, and I didn't assess if they actually had social support or what they considered social support. It was based on their perception. So, and you know, like I said, their perception is what really matters in this situation. So as long as they perceived that they had adequate support, they were scoring lower and doing better. So And then the participants who had a spouse diagnosed with PTSD were at a higher risk of screening for the disorder with P equals 0.001. So, like I had figured, the spouses whose service member had been diagnosed with PTSD, they were showing more symptoms of trauma and anxiety and depression and sleep problems. So, and I read a lot of really interesting articles about PTSD, and the one that I really liked addressed whether it was contagious. And that's kind of the secondary trauma. So I thought that was a really good way of putting it, of it being contagious, because when you're living in an environment with someone who's always so hyper vigilant, that it really starts to rub off on you. And that's kind of what this shows, that it does affect the whole family. So, sorry. And then the participants who indicated that their spouse never verbally shares his experience were more at risk for screening positive for MSST, which P equals 0.037. So with that one, I asked the question, I can't verbatim, but basically what the question was my spouse shares stories from his deployment with me. So from never to always and in between. So originally I had thought that the spouses who were being told these stories would be more impacted, because that's how secondary trauma works. You're told the stories and then you become traumatized with it. But I actually found the reverse. The ones that never talked about what happened to them, their spouses were exhibiting more symptoms than the ones who were told about it, which was completely opposite of what I thought at first, but it turned out to be more interesting, so I'm glad that we found that, because we kind of have this theory that the spouses who aren't being told what happened, they make it up in their own mind, and they are watching the news, so they may exaggerate it and make it worse than it actually was, so it impacts them even more. So that was just kind of my theory on that, because I expected the opposite, but it kind of makes sense that if they're never talked to about it and you kind of make it up in your mind and think those things and you don't know what really happened, that you could exaggerate it out and have these symptoms. So some of the other things that were very interesting was the rank of the service member was significant in the mental health of the spouse. So for those who were married to an enlisted member, the M was 201, while officers was 161. So, right.
You account for that?
And
I see a qualitative study.
We have some theories. Obviously, financial-wise, the officers and finances impact everything. So the officers are more financially stable. They're also more educated. So there's the assumption that the spouse may be more educated as well and better able to cope. They may be also a little older. So there's all those compounding factors to it.
And I feel that the officers, as because they're there for a long time in the military, so maybe they are more, a little sophisticated in dealing with expressing their, traumas
Right.
to their spouses than younger folks are.
Right.
And and I'm sure they have way more outlets that they can spread this thing rather than dumping the whole thing on your wife.
Right. And
the type of deployment would be different for an officer than for...
And that's what I was going to say. There's this safety perception as well, because typically officers are in a more safe type role than being enlisted and on the front lines. And also, another theory that was tossed at me at the conference was the ability to communicate, because typically officers are able to communicate with the spouses more so than an enlisted member. So there's a lot of compounding factors to it. I wish that I would have known enough going into it to look at that more, but now I know, and so yes, it's definitely something to look at for sure. So I just wanted to initially assess the difference between, and I didn't expect it to be that big of a difference. So in hindsight, I wish I would have looked at it more, but there's always next time. So then here's just some of kind of our runnings. And this is looking at the mental versus the physical injuries. So these findings indicate that mental and or behavioral changes in the service member, as in the case with PTSD, may prove more difficult for the spouse to cope with than physical injuries. So you can see that, you know, it was significant up here, but not down here. And I wasn't really sure what I thought was going to happen with that one, but with the physical injuries, I think there's more understanding, because if you lost your leg, people can look at that and see what's going on, versus if they're living with someone with PTSD, they may not be able to explain that to anyone. Nobody may, you know, they may not have anyone to help them process this and say, my husband's a completely different person, you don't understand, this is not the guy that I married. So it's stressful, and you know, they've kind of coined the term the invisible injuries for the war, and it's very much so, and it seems that that's impacting the spouses as well, because they are more able to cope and deal with actual physical injuries than the mental disorders in the spouses. And we kind of looked at how the spouses are addressing these issues, or if they had addressed them at all with like a mental health provider. So from what I got 81 was the N, so 37% of the participants indicated that they visit their primary care physician, which is their doctor, for any of the symptoms assessed. So in the military, you're assigned your PCP, and that's who you go to for practically anything. And if you want to see someone else, you have to have a referral, and you also have to have mental health referral to be able to talk to a mental health provider. So it makes sense that they would go to their primary care physician, which means that typically they're given prescriptions to deal with this. So like it says, it indicates that the spouses are utilizing medical professionals to treat mental health conditions. And those who visited outside civilian providers were more likely to be prescribed medication, which I thought was absolutely just fascinating to me, because I've had experience with going to the PCP and here you go, have all these pills. But actually it was kind of the opposite. We found that if they went to an outside provider, they were more likely to be prescribed a medication such as antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication. So when we looked at that, we also looked at whether or not they were given a referral to go talk to a mental health provider. And actually, in the majority of the cases, they were actually referred to talk to someone. So there are referrals happening, and the ones that went to their PCP were being referred in most cases to talk to someone. So then our kind of future thoughts, so an exploratory factor analysis will be conducted to examine the constructs of the questionnaire. So we're going to break down our questionnaire and look at what is actually making up this condition, like what are we looking at? And we kind of had some thoughts on what we're looking at, but you know, you gotta have proof. So we'll be doing that. We're going to be doing additional analyses, and we're going to do multiple regression, and we'll be performed on it to further investigate and understand the variables and how they impact the mental health of military spouses. And also, we're going to do some further investigation into the impact of a service member's PTSD on the trauma symptoms of their spouses. So,
and another thing that also I found interesting in the results is that, you know, these days we have the electronic communication. We have, you know, unlike the older days, spouses now can, even if your husband is deployed, you can Skype with them, you can talk with them. So is it a good thing or a bad thing? Because, you know, what used to happen earlier is that for as long as you're out, you get those telegrams or some information, you don't get this live, whenever you want kind of a, you know, interaction. One of the things that we found that spouses who are having this electronic communication with their husbands while they're on deployment show more anxiety.
yes.
You know?
Which which makes sense
It does.
in a construed kind of way.
Counterintuitive.
Right.
It makes sense.
Yes.
Because they're more alert as to what's going on. They know, oh, he's going on a mission. So if I know he's going on a mission and he's supposed to be back in 2 days and I don't hear him for another week, here I am thinking the worst has happened. So it makes sense, even though you would assume that frequent communication would be a protective factor. It's not. It's yes.
This updated information about what's going on, the more you get during the deployment, is kind of negatively influences your anxiety levels and mental health than otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's something to think about.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting.
And I think that's it. Yeah, that was all I had. So
So I want to know everything that you do here on out. And I also,
Yes.
have you written a paper? Or?
We are writing a paper.
we are
Okay.
for publication.
Good.
We collected the data. We ended up collecting the data last summer, and then since then we have going through stuff ourselves.
Life has happened. Yeah.
So we have the data, and I think that by end of May we are planning to get the first paper out of it, the factor analysis paper. After that we will try the once the measures are we understand the construct, then we're going to run multiple regression on them, and then we are really hoping that we will call a new kind of measurement scale that will custom make for this population,
Yes.
because I don't think that the issues that the contextual understanding of mental health measurement is very important, and I think that this is what the contribution will be that we
Definitely.
That's awesome.
Definitely.
I really do want to share this information. So how can I, should I give you my son and my daughter-in-laws? I mean, they're both, one's almost a PhD, one's a PhD. They will be so interested in this.
Yeah, definitely. We will definitely, yeah.
Yeah, definitely so. I would be very interested in talking to your son, especially
Okay.
I will send a email with
Very
all three
good.
of us, and then you can.
because I would love to look at the male perspective, but it's such a small demographic, and it's
And since they are psychologists and rehabilitation folks, they will also have some perspective on the mental
Right.
health.
It will.
Yeah.
It will be interesting to them from a personal perspective.
Right, exactly.
And from a clinical professional perspective.
exactly.
This
Yeah.
is really exciting.
It really is. I was very excited when we pulled the data and started doing the analysis, and I was just like, wow, I did this.
So we are very hopeful that we are going to be done with a major part of the data analysis by summer, and maybe the next fall round bag we can sign up, and Tonya can come in.
I'll be here.
Yeah, and
Yes,
share
very
some of those stuff with you.
Yeah, I got really good feedback when I went to the national conference in Florida and presented, and it was really exciting because people that literally wrote our textbooks on military social work were complimenting me on my work, so it was very exciting. It was a really good experience, and I got very, very good feedback, and everybody was really excited to see somebody looking at the spouse population, so because it's very neglected, and like I said, it affects retention, and it does matter to the military. They should care about this population.
And the thing is that following that, currently that we are collecting some data to that kind of a segue to the current research is, in spite of all this cultural, so enmeshed in military culture, getting this, secondary trauma issues, many times after deployment, when they come back, they just say the word divorce. So what happens is that, the divorce rate in military after coming back is quite high.
Mm-hmm.
So the moment a spouse is divorced, what happens is that the spouse overnight becomes a civilian. So your access to military bases, your access to all these things. So you have a change in identity on paper, but your culture is still military. But you're considered on paper and for all legal purposes and all benefit given institution considers you a civilian.
Yes.
But you are no longer in military, but you suffer from the same military, cultural, and other stuff that you have been suffering all your life.
Yeah.
So this is a identity displacement that further pushes this whole mental health issues
Sure.
behind for this population. We're trying to collect some interviews, qualitative interviews from spouses who have gone through divorce, and then trying to see how this culture change is affecting, so that military as an institution first of all need to recognize that that overnight, you cannot even enter the base.
Right.
You are, like something that you're waiting, you're organizing spouse arrival, during the deployment, you are managing many spousal organization on the base.
Right.
You're doing so involved in the community that you have not seen anything else outside, and then suddenly overnight you're
And
a
it's
civilian.
gone.
Boom, you're a civilian, and you cannot even enter. So that is huge,
is.
Yes.
So that also affects, because many of them still suffer mental health issues while not recognized as a
Right.
military community at all.
Yes, and no longer in their peer group.
Right.
No longer their peer group, no longer accessing their services.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We found some really, really interesting stuff on that aspect of it. So,
Work.
thank you.
All right, well, send an email out.
I
I really
will.
do want to connect everybody.
Yeah.
This is interesting.
Thank you.
Definitely interested in
Yeah,
it.
thank you
Thank you
so
guys. Thanks for listening to me.
Oh, you're, good work.
Thank you.